the Rourans were a people shaped by their environment. They roamed the unforgiving plains and mountains of Central Asia, living in a world where survival was always a challenge, yet they thrived. In historical records, they're often overshadowed by other nomadic empires, but their impact on the region was significant. From the mid-4th to the mid-6th century, the Rourans ruled a vast territory, spanning regions that would eventually be claimed by powerful groups like the Mongols and Turks. Their lifestyle was mobile, and they never tied down to any one place. The Rourans didn't build cities or large settlements. Instead, they lived in tents, dome-shaped structures made from felt, designed for easy assembly and transport. Moving with the seasons, they followed the rhythm of the land, always searching for fresh grasslands to feed their livestock. Life in the harsh climate of Central Asia meant that they had to make the most of what little the land offered. Grass grew sparsely, but their animals, horses and cattle, were well adapted to this lifestyle, surviving on whatever dry vegetation they could find, even eating snow when necessary. The Rouran survival was closely linked to their ability to move swiftly. Their migrations were carefully timed, summers in Mongolia, winters further south, and sometimes across the Gobi Desert. These movements were more than just practical, they were essential for their livestock and, by extension, their own livelihood. Severe weather or droughts could disrupt their routes, but more often than not, they followed well-worn paths that had been used for generations. The Rourans' timed migrations not only supported their daily existence, but also had significant strategic importance, as seen in their interactions with neighboring powers, such as the Toba Tao's campaigns. So in 429, Toba Tao, the king of the Tuoba tribes, planned to lead some counterattacks against the Rourans' horde in the eastern Gobi Desert. When some of his advisors warned him that while he was busy fighting, the Chinese Empire to the south might take the opportunity to cause trouble, his response was, "The Chinese are foot soldiers and we are horsemen. What can a herd of colts and heifers do against tigers or a pack of wolves? As for the Juan, they graze in the north during the summer. In autumn, they come south, and in winter raid our frontiers. We have only to attack them in summer in their pasture lands. At that time their horses are useless, the stallions are busy with the fillies, and the mares with their foals. If we but come upon them there, and cut them off from their grazing and their water, within a few days they will be either taken or destroyed." In times of conflict or threat from enemies, they would retreat to remote valleys, abandoning their carts and herds if needed, to ensure their survival. Despite the Rourans' large sphere of influence, there's very little physical evidence of their existence today. Archaeological findings are scarce, and what we know about them mostly comes from ancient Chinese records. The Weishu and other dynastic histories paint a vivid picture of their society, but even these accounts leave much open to interpretation. Scholars have pieced together their story from these texts, but many aspects of the Rourans' history remain unclear or heavily debated. Even their name, Rouran, wasn't even their original one, but a label they adopted, which over time became synonymous with their ruling elite and eventually the entire group. Some Chinese records even transformed their name into Rouran, a derogatory term that means wriggling insects. This insult stemmed from tensions with their fierce rivals, the Tauba or Northern Wei, who dominated northern China during this era. The rise of the Rourans as a political force can be traced back to the late 4th century AD in the northern steppes of Mongolia and Manchuria. During this period, the Tauba had begun to expand their control in northern China, establishing the Northern Wei dynasty. It was against this backdrop that the Rouran began organizing themselves into a formidable political entity, eventually becoming one of the dominant powers in the region. To understand the formation of the Rouran Khaganate, we need to recognize that nomadic societies developed states quite differently from settled ones. Nomads like the Rourans didn't rely on centralized governments or agriculture. They lived independently, resolving disputes informally, and moved when conflicts arose. However, they often united during wars or to take control of key trade routes, laying the foundation for nomadic empires. A major factor behind these empires was trade. Lacking luxury goods such as silk and jewelry, nomads depended on trade, or more often, raiding and extorting nearby agricultural societies. The Rouran Khagan played a crucial role in controlling the distribution of these goods, which strengthened his authority and maintained the empire's stability. The organization of nomadic empires often reflected the size and wealth of nearby agricultural civilizations like China. Stronger and wealthier neighbors pressured nomads to form more centralized units, a pattern seen worldwide where nomads bordered large agricultural societies. The rise and fall of agricultural dynasties like China's Han and Tang directly affected the fortunes of nearby nomadic empires. For instance, the Xiongnu rose with the Han, the Turks with the Tang, and the Mongols with the Song and Jin, demonstrating the deep interconnection between nomadic and settled societies. For the Rouran, however, the key to success was unity. Nomadic societies were typically scattered, with different tribes spread out across vast areas. To form an empire, they needed a strong leader who could unite these tribes under one banner. In the case of the Rouran, that leader was Selûne. A descendant of the legendary Rouran leader Milu, Selûne emerged as the figure who would forge the Rouran Khaganate. Selûne's early life was marked by hardship. He witnessed the brutal invasions of the Toba and the loss of his family, experiences that shaped his desire to break free from Toba control. In 394 AD, he made his move, fleeing west and joining forces with his uncle. Over the next several years, Selûne systematically eliminated his rivals and built up his power base, uniting various Mongolian and Turkic-speaking tribes under his leadership. By 402 AD, Selûne had consolidated enough power to formally declare the establishment of the Rouran Khaganate. He took on the title Khagan, marking his position as the supreme ruler. Selûne then reorganized Rouran society, setting up a strict military system where warriors were registered and divided into units with harsh punishments for disobedience. This system of governance bore similarities to what earlier steppe leaders like Maudu of the Xiongnu had implemented, and what Chinggis Khan would later perfect. The Rouran Khaganate became a formidable power in the region, balancing against the two dominant Chinese states of the time, the Song dynasty in the south and the Toba Empire in the north. Occupying much of what is today Mongolia, the Rourans played a key role in regional politics, not just through warfare, but also by controlling trade routes and interacting with settled societies to their south. The story of the Rourans and their interactions with the Chinese powers of the time, particularly the Toba, is one of constant struggle, shifting alliances, and resilience. These two groups, despite their cultural and political differences, were bound together by geography and power dynamics, leading to frequent conflict and occasional cooperation. The Rouran, a confederation of nomadic tribes, established their power in the vast northern steppes, while the Toba, originally part of the Xianbei people, rose to prominence in northern China, eventually forming the Northern Wei dynasty. Their rivalry shaped much of the political landscape of the region in the 4th and 5th centuries. The Rourans' ascent as a significant political force happened alongside the rise of the Northern Wei dynasty. Under rulers like Toba Gui, the Wei sought to consolidate control over northern China, often at the expense of their nomadic neighbors. As the Wei expanded, they frequently clashed with the Rourans who resisted their advances. In response, the Northern Wei launched several military campaigns against the Rourans, inflicting heavy losses but never fully dismantling the Rouran Confederation. One of the most notable campaigns occurred in 429 AD, when the Northern Wei dealt a significant blow to the Rouran forces. However, despite these defeats, the Rourans remained a persistent threat to the Wei, continuing to raid and harass their borders. This back-and-forth struggle lasted well into the late 5th century, with major campaigns occurring as late as 492 AD. Although individual tribes and camps within the Rouran were occasionally subdued, the confederation as a whole endured, maintaining its power in the northern steppes. The Rouran Khaganate's relationship with the Chinese states was defined by a mixture of diplomacy, aggression, and pragmatism. Like many nomadic empires in Inner Asia, the Rouran relied on a combination of raids and negotiations to maintain their influence and ensure their survival. At times, they would launch raids into Chinese territory, looting and pillaging, only to follow these attacks with peaceful negotiations, often seeking gifts or tribute from the Chinese in exchange for peace. This pattern played out several times throughout the Rourans' history. For instance, after launching raids in 402, 406, 409, and 415, the Rouran would negotiate peace treaties with the Northern Wei, securing valuable goods in the process. A similar dynamic unfolded in 431 and 434, following another series of attacks and counterattacks. These interactions highlight the delicate balance between conflict and diplomacy that characterized Rouran-Chinese relations. However, the Rouran didn't always have the upper hand. Between 438 and 470 AD, they faced numerous challenges. Not only did the Wei continue their attacks on Rouran camps, but severe droughts in outer Mongolia left the nomads in a weakened state. These years were difficult for Rouran rulers like Khagans Tuhozhen and Yucheng, who struggled to keep the confederation united. Despite these setbacks, they managed to maintain their political structure, relying on both military and diplomatic strategies to navigate these turbulent times. One key tactic the Rourans employed to strengthen their ties with China was through marriage alliances. In 476, Yucheng Khagan requested a marriage alliance with the Northern Wei, seeking to marry a Chinese princess. Though this marriage ultimately didn't happen, the request itself demonstrates the importance of such unions in maintaining political stability. Marriages were a symbolic and practical way to forge stronger ties between the nomads and the settled agricultural societies of China. Later, during the reign of Anagui Khagan, the Rouran managed to secure another marriage alliance with Northern Wei. This marked a period where the Rouran became more assertive in their dealings with the Chinese, as they were no longer simply seeking favor, but actively positioning themselves as equal partners. The Chinese, facing internal revolts, found themselves in need of Rouran military support, further shifting the balance of power. By the mid-6th century, the Rouran were no longer viewed merely as vassals, but as significant players in the regional power structure. The exchange of gifts played a crucial role in maintaining diplomatic relations between the Rouran and the Chinese states. The nomads would offer horses, furs, and other animals, while the Chinese often reciprocated with luxurious goods like silk, textiles, and decorated weapons. These exchanges were more than just material transactions. They were symbolic acts that reinforced the relationship between the two powers. For the Rourans, these gifts were a means of securing peace and demonstrating their wealth and influence. For the Chinese, they were a way of asserting cultural superiority, even when they found themselves on the defensive militarily. At times, the Rourans used these gift exchanges to assert their equality with, or even superiority over the Chinese. By the time of Anagui Khagan's reign, the Rouran had grown confident enough to no longer refer to themselves as mere vassals when sending tributes to the Chinese court. This growing self-assurance reflected the shifting power dynamics between the two groups as the Northern Wei dynasty weakened. The Rourans developed a distinct political and military organization under their leaders. One of their most notable rulers was Selûne, who assumed power around 402 AD and was instrumental in shaping the Rourans' polity. Selûne implemented a military system based on the decimal structure, which organized his warriors into groups of tens, hundreds, and thousands. He also introduced legal and military reforms that strengthened the Rouran Confederation, making it a formidable force in the region. His innovations included a method of record-keeping using notches on wood and sheep dung before a more sophisticated system was developed. Under Selûne's leadership, the Rourans expanded their territory, encompassing Mongolia, parts of southern Manchuria, and the Tarim Basin. The Rouran Empire was polyglot and multi-ethnic, reflecting the diverse nature of their confederation. They ruled over various tribes, including the Xiongnu and Turkic peoples, such as the Gauche, who were among their most significant subjects. These tribes frequently shifted their allegiances between the Rouran and the Toba Wei, depending on the political climate. At its core, the Rouran Khaganate was an imperial confederation. This means that while the Rouran tribes themselves formed the heart of the empire, they were joined by other groups. These included allied tribes. Some were ethnically similar to the Rouran and willingly accepted their leadership. These tribes could be seen as being on a leash under the control of the Rouran rulers. Conquered peoples. Other groups, like the Uyghurs or certain Turkic-speaking tribes, were forced into the confederation after being defeated in battle. The survival and power of the Rouran Khaganate were largely based on external exploitation, especially through raiding. When the Rourans were strong, they would alternate between raiding and extorting wealth from China and other neighboring regions. They aimed to control trade routes in Central Asia, which allowed them to profit from trade going to and from the West. Besides China, they also raided neighboring states and oases, keeping smaller and weaker territories in constant fear of their attacks. This aggressive approach to expansion was a key strategy for the Rourans. The empire was divided into two main wings, an eastern and a western wing. Initially, the ruler of the eastern wing had a higher status, but this arrangement likely shifted over time. The Rouran Empire was built on a strong military foundation. Selûne, the founder of the Khaganate, introduced a decimal system to organize the military, a common practice in nomadic empires. A group of 1,000 soldiers formed a detachment led by a military leader. A group of 100 soldiers made up a banner, also with a designated leader. This structure helped create an organized and efficient military force. A well-organized army has a significant advantage over a disorganized one, even if it is smaller in size. History shows that many smaller but well-organized armies have triumphed over much larger ones, simply because they were better coordinated. In the case of the Rouran, their tribal societies organization, though different from that of state societies, benefited from this military structure. When needed, military forces were drawn from the various tribes within the empire. If there was a serious threat, the entire male population could be called upon to defend the empire. According to Chinese chroniclers, at the height of their power between 470 and 520, the Rouran could field an army of 100,000 to 300,000 mounted warriors. This was a number comparable to other major nomadic powers like the Xiongnu. Though the Rouran Khaganate only lasted about 150 years, its rise and fall followed a pattern typical of nomadic empires. There were two significant periods of power. First peak under Saloon and his immediate successors between 402 and 429. Second peak during the process of Sinicization, that is adoption of Chinese culture, under Anagui, between 521 and 552. The empire also faced two major crises, between 438 and 470, and between 519 and 521. The title of Khagan was introduced by Saloon, and it marked the highest rank in the empire. Leadership was passed down either through direct succession or through a collateral line within the ruling clan. This kept power within the same family or close relatives, ensuring that the leadership stayed within the same tribal group. From the perspective of the Chinese chroniclers, the Rouran system of governance was quite simple. For example, early on, they didn't even have written records and would count their warriors by using sheep droppings. Over time, however, they learned to use notches on wood to keep track of numbers. The Khagan ruled from a central headquarters known as the Ting. According to Chinese sources, this headquarters was northwest of Gansu, though Mongolian historians place it north of the Khangai Mountains along the Orkhon River. The location likely shifted over time as the empire's priorities and needs changed. One legendary capital of the empire was known as Mumochang, which eventually became the center of the Khagan's rule. Important decisions for the empire were likely made by a council of top officials, who gathered in the capital to resolve major issues. Though the system seemed simple, it was effective enough to manage a large and complex nomadic empire. The Rouran Khaganate was a powerful nomadic empire that thrived through military prowess, external exploitation, and a vast network of alliances and conquests. Its leaders, starting with Saloon, built a structured and efficient military system, which allowed them to control a vast territory and challenge major powers like China. The power of a ruler in the steppe societies such as the Rouran Khaganate relied heavily on external factors. The Khagan, or supreme ruler, held the highest authority in the empire and was responsible for leading military campaigns and establishing foreign relations, particularly with China. The Khagan's success depended on his ability to secure wealth for his people through warfare where they could seize plunder, and diplomacy where they could extract gifts from their Chinese neighbors. For the nomads under the Khagan's rule, their well-being relied on maintaining strict military discipline, whether in peacetime or during war. Those who displayed bravery in battle were rewarded with captives and spoils, while cowards were severely punished, either stoned to death or beaten. This intense discipline helped ensure that the Khagan's authority was respected and the empire remained strong. According to Chinese chroniclers, Saloon, the first Rouran Khagan, was a ruler with the typical traits of a powerful autocrat: cruel, determined, cunning, and adaptable. These qualities made him an effective leader. Another ruler, Doluan Khagan, was also known for his cruelty, but it was his boldness and decisiveness that made him charismatic in the eyes of his people. Charisma and authority were key for a Khagan to maintain control over his empire. Without them, a Khagan could be abandoned by his people. This was common in Inner Asian history, dating back to the Xiongnu times, where a ruler who was cruel, lacked authority, or lost his fortune could be deserted by his subjects. A significant event occurred in 492 under Dulun Khagan's rule. Dulun's cruelty and loss of authority prompted Abu Zailo, a brave Uyghur chief, to lead 100,000 tents of Rouran people westward, away from the Khagan's rule. Determined to recover from this loss, Dulun sent two armies to pursue Abu Zailo, one led by Dulun himself, and the other by his uncle Nagai. However, Dulun suffered several defeats, while Nagai won his battles against the Uyghurs. The Rouran people began to lose faith in Dulun's ability to lead. According to the chroniclers, they believed that heaven had withdrawn its favor from Dulun and bestowed it upon Nagai instead. As a result, they wanted to replace Dulun with Nagai as their ruler. Although Nagai initially resisted breaking with tradition, the belief in his charisma and favor with heaven was so strong that the people took matters into their own hands. They murdered Dulun and his close family members and elevated Nagai to the throne. This shift in leadership demonstrates a key concept in Rouran society: the traditional type of domination where a ruler's legitimacy came from the people's belief in the sacredness of tradition and the ruler's connection to the divine. If a Khagan failed to maintain this divine favor, his rule became unstable. From Selûne onward, all Rouran Khagans came from the same ruling clan, which claimed descent from their mythological first ancestor, Muilu. The succession of Khagans within the Rouran Khaganate followed both direct and collateral lines of descent. It appears that while every Khagan wished to pass the throne to his eldest son, external factors such as weak leadership or instability sometimes led to a more powerful or charismatic relative taking over. Each new Khagan was given a grand title upon their ascension to the throne, a tradition that started with Selûne. By 464, under the 7th Khagan Yucheng, the Rouran began adopting epic names similar to Chinese etiquette, further solidifying their power and connection to broader traditions of the empire. The social structure of the Rouran Khaganate is not well documented in historical sources. However, from what we do know and by looking at similar nomadic societies, we can piece together a fairly reliable picture of how their society was organized. At the top of the hierarchy was the Khagan, the ruler of the Khaganate. The title Khagan wasn't just a simple designation, it often came with grand epithets like victorious or godlike, emphasizing the ruler's strength and divine favor. The Khagan's wife held the title of Khagatun, a position of high status that mirrored her husband's role. Like most monarchies, power was passed down within the ruling family. All Rouran Khagans claimed descent from their legendary ancestor Muilu, a figure who, according to Chinese chronicles, began life as a fugitive slave. However, this detail is likely an embellishment by Chinese historians to portray the Rourans as having lowly origins, a common practice aimed at belittling the barbarian nomads. Below the Khagan were the grandees, high-ranking members of the Rouran elite, referred to in Chinese chronicles as dachin, that is, dignitaries. They assisted the Khagan in running the empire and leading military operations. These dignitaries were often given nicknames reflecting their qualities, such as Badr, Sechin, Mergan, or Boko. The grandees were divided into higher and lower ranks, including military commanders, tribal chiefs, and elders, forming a nomadic aristocracy. Their positions were typically inherited, but the Khagan could also grant titles for exceptional service. For example, in 518, Diwan, a wise sorceress, was given the title of Khagatun after marrying Nagai Khagan for her service. Her former husband was compensated with a title, position, and livestock. By the mid-5th century, specific Rouran titles began appearing, often reflecting military roles or social status. Examples include Mafu and Mohitu, equivalent to Badr, meaning warrior or hero. Sijin, possibly from the Turkic Erkin. Zielifa, possibly related to the Turkic Eltabar. These titles, seen in Rouran envoys' names visiting Chinese courts, often indicated roles in military or governance. The title Silifa was given to close relatives of the Khagan who commanded large military units, suggesting regional leadership. Military commanders, usually tribal chiefs or elders, led units of 1,000 or 100 horsemen, holding significant authority in military operations. Rouran society was built on families, clans, and tribes, which maintained real or distant genealogical ties. These groups worked together economically, forming the backbone of nomadic life. The size of these groups varied, with records showing 10 large nomadic camps in 521. At the base of society were ordinary pastoral nomads, who supported the economy and provided soldiers for the Khagan's army. The Rouran also had individuals in bondage or patron-client relationships, working for wealthier benefactors. While slavery wasn't widespread, it did exist. In 521, Anagui Khagan received 2 bondmaids from the Chinese emperor. Saloon also promised captives to soldiers who distinguished themselves in battle, and there are mentions of driving agricultural people into the steppe, though enslaving prisoners of war isn't specifically recorded. However, it's likely the Rouran followed similar practices to other Eurasian pastoral nomads. During its existence from 402 to 555, the administrative and political structure of the Rouran Khaganate went through several changes. In the late 5th century, the historian Shang Yu described the Rouran government as being very simple, reflecting their nomadic roots. However, as time went on, the Rourans began to adopt more elements from the Chinese, especially when it came to administrative practices. By the end of the 5th century, the Rourans had adopted the Chinese written language for diplomatic correspondence and internal record-keeping. This allowed them to communicate more effectively with the northern Chinese dynasties. Sources from this period even mention a growing number of literate individuals within the Rouran society, suggesting that the use of written Chinese had become more common by the early 6th century. Around this time, under the reign of Anagui Khagan, the Rourans took another significant step. They built their first capital city, Mumasheng. The city was fortified with 2 walls, but unfortunately, no trace of this town has been found, leaving historians to debate its exact location. Nevertheless, the construction of Mumasheng marked a shift from the traditional nomadic lifestyle to a more settled administrative center. Under Anagui, there were noticeable changes in the Rouran administration, many of which were influenced by Chinese governance models. Anagui introduced official titles and posts similar to those found in the Chinese courts, even though this was somewhat out of step with the traditional nomadic way of life. He also established a system of written records at his headquarters and formed a group of bodyguards, referred to in Chinese as chamberlains or secretaries. These officials, modeled after Chinese practices, served as advisors to the Khagan. One of the most influential figures during this period was Xunyu Tan, a Chinese emigrant who became Anagui's chief advisor. Xunyu Tan played a role similar to other key Chinese advisors in nomadic courts, like Zhong Hongyu for the Xiongnu or Yelu Chuzai for the Mongols. He helped introduce Chinese administrative ideas to the Rourans, though it's important to note that these changes were mostly surface-level adaptations. The deeper nomadic traditions remained intact. Chinese documents from this time began to describe the Rouran society as made up of officials and people, suggesting a more formal hierarchy, though it is likely that these changes were more about appearance than actual bureaucratic structure. The Chinese-style posts such as chamberlain were more reflective of courtly life than real governmental administration. Xunyu Tan himself, despite being grandly titled, seemed to hold multiple roles, including that of chamberlain. This suggests that the Rourans were still in the early stages of developing a government system, similar to how Chinggis Khan first organized his empire centuries later. The Rourans' gradual adoption of Chinese administrative practices might have been influenced by their close interactions with the Northern Wei dynasty, which also had nomadic origins. Cultural differences between the two groups were not as stark as they might have been between the Rouran and other settled Chinese dynasties, so it's possible that the Rourans felt less resistance to adopting these foreign customs. The Northern Wei had successfully transitioned from a nomadic lifestyle to a more settled and bureaucratic one, and it's likely the Rourans saw this as a model to follow. It's also possible that the Rouran Khaganate had a small population of agricultural people living within its borders. However, they were primarily a nomadic society, and the number of farmers was probably quite low. One piece of evidence for this comes from 522, when Anagui Khagan requested a large amount of millet seeds from the Chinese. He received 340,000 liters of millet, which would have been enough to sustain a population of around 1,500 to 2,000 people, likely much smaller than similar agricultural settlements in the region. The nomads themselves didn't rely heavily on grains, except during times of famine, so it's possible that the seeds were consumed as food during a particularly harsh year, rather than used for planting. There is speculation that Anagui Khagan might have been trying to transform the Rouran Khaganate into a more settled nomadic agricultural state, similar to other barbarian dynasties of the time. This could explain why he moved his court to Luoyang, a city in China, just before the fall of the Rouran Khaganate. By moving to Luoyang, he may have been trying to integrate more with Chinese society, establishing a stronger agricultural base while maintaining nomadic traditions. However, this effort was ultimately unsuccessful, as the Rouran Khaganate collapsed shortly after this. By the late 5th century, the Rourans were no longer the united force they had once been. factions within the confederation, splitting into eastern and western groups, created internal strife that weakened their political cohesion. This division made them vulnerable to external enemies, and the growing power of the Gokturks only exacerbated their troubles. The Gokturks, who had been part of the Rourans' dominion, seized the opportunity to rebel under Bumin Khan's leadership. In 552 AD, the Gokturks decisively defeated the Rourans, establishing their own empire, the Turkic Khaganate. The Rouran confederation, now fractured and leaderless, effectively ceased to exist as a significant political entity. After their defeat, many Rouran survivors fled westward seeking refuge from the Gokturks' expansion. Some historians believe that these displaced Rourans may have merged with or influenced the European Avars, a nomadic group that appeared in Eastern Europe during the mid-6th century. Byzantine sources from this period describe a group called the Avars, who claimed descent from the same Rouran rulers who once held power in the steppes of Central Asia. The European Avars adopted titles like Khan and Khan for their leaders, terms historically associated with the Rouran. However, scholars continue to debate the precise ethnic and cultural links between the Rouran and the Avars. While the Avar leadership may have had ties to the Rouran elite, it is likely that they incorporated other ethnic groups during their westward migration, resulting in a mixed identity by the time they established their empire in Eastern Europe. The Avars initially settled in the northern Caucasus before making contact with the Byzantine Empire around 557 or 558 AD. By 567 AD, they had moved into the Carpathian Basin, where they defeated the Germanic Gepids and seized control of the region. Over the next few decades, the Avars built a powerful empire known as the Avar Khaganate, which would rival the Byzantine Empire by the late 6th century. At the height of their power in the early 7th century, the Avars controlled large parts of Central and Eastern Europe, including territories that once belonged to the Huns and Lombards. However, the Avar Khaganate eventually declined due to internal strife and external pressures. In 796 AD, the Franks under Charlemagne defeated the Avars, leading to the disintegration of their empire. The few remaining Avars were absorbed into Slavic communities, disappearing from the historical record long before the Hungarians arrived in the region in the late 9th century. Genetic studies on the Avars and their possible Rouran ancestors have revealed a complex picture of mixed origins. DNA evidence from Avar elite graves shows a significant portion of their Y chromosomes come from Eastern Eurasia, indicating a Northern Asian origin for part of their population. However, other genetic markers suggest Western Eurasian ancestry, pointing to the Avars' multi-ethnic makeup, which likely developed as they migrated west and absorbed various peoples along the way. A genome from a Rouran individual discovered in a tomb in Mongolia has helped shed some light on the genetic makeup of this elusive group. The analysis revealed that this individual shared genetic traits with populations from Mongolia and the Amur River Basin, suggesting that the Rouran likely originated from the greater Kingon Mountains. This genome also shows links to modern Mongolic-speaking populations, indicating that the Rouran may have contributed to the genetic ancestry of these groups. The Rouran Confederation, though once a dominant force in Central Asia, met its end through internal divisions and the rise of the Gokturks in the mid-6th century. While some Rouran remnants disappeared from history, others may have contributed to the formation of the European Avars, who played a significant role in the history of Eastern Europe. Although the precise ethnic and cultural links between the Rouran and Avars remain debated, their legacy, both genetic and political, persisted in various forms, influencing the nomadic peoples who succeeded them. The few genetic studies that have been conducted offer a glimpse into the Rourans' origins and connections to other steppe populations, but much about their identity remains shrouded in mystery. I hope you've enjoyed the video, and thanks for watching.